Paul Weller's new single. Available at all good record stores. And iTunes. I wish. Right, are we all caffeinated? Good. Okay. Rock and roll. I think we'll have a little bit of change of pace. A little bit of change of topic. Get away from this kind of... I said at the beginning I didn't want to hear IE. Thank you very much. Right. Doors. So, as well as being really frustrated by certain web browsers without a name, I'm also really, as a designer, really frustrated by typography on the web as well. Does anybody else share that thing? So what I want to do is to spend a little bit of time. Now, we've got an hour and a half, which we can extend a little bit if anybody wants to go. I don't know how long this is going to take, so if we kind of run over, then we run over, and if we get kicked out, we get kicked out. But there's been quite a lot more focus in discussions fairly recently about what we can do typographical-wise with CSS to improve typography and readability of content and things like that. And has anybody been keeping up with some of this stuff? Mark Bolton's been writing a lot about it. Sorry? Oh yeah, absolutely. See, well, Mark was the one of the technical editors on a certain book without name, available from all good bookstores. And one of the reasons why I got Mark to do that was because he is a web geek, but he's not just a web geek. I mean, he's not quite as old as us, but he certainly comes from 150. He comes from a traditional graphic design background. And that really appeals because he's got a lot of grounding in things that quite often on the web we lack experience in. And a lot of people come to web design from different disciplines. So you're going to get people that have come from a technical background, and all of a sudden they're charged with trying to represent or trying to interpret design jobs using markup and CSS, but they haven't necessarily got an eye for detail or an understanding of typographical or grid layout principles. And then you get people that have, particularly younger guys, anybody that's, younger than me, which is a lot, that have kind of never designed for print either. So everything that they do, all their experience is down to, what they've seen go on the web, and they learn from other websites. And particularly where typography is concerned, learning from other websites isn't exactly the best example, because for the most part, web typography sucks. And lots of new or recent discussions have been going on by Mark and Koivin, who works for the New York Times, and Richard Rutter, who's at clagnut.com, and he's been going through a book by Robert Brinkhurst, The Elements of Typographical Style, and rewriting it essentially and republishing it on the web. So it's the elements of typographical style applied to the web, and it's all available online. It's really good stuff. So there's been a lot of discussions about simple ways in which we can improve web typography, without having to get into the conversations necessarily about image replacement or flash replacement. Has anybody used Cipher, the old flash headings replacement thing? Yeah, a fair few people. So really what we're talking about for this particular session is not fonts, because fonts are a whole other issue. The type of and the limiting number of fonts that we've got available, system fonts, etc., across platforms, that's a whole conversation in its own right. And you know, yeah, it'd be really nice to be able to use more varied fonts. And there are some moves, particularly within the CSS working group, in ways in which we can start embedding fonts and using fonts. Did anybody see the List Apart article that How Come Lee did fairly recently? About the ability to be able to link to a font in exactly the same way as you might link to a style sheet or link to an image. Now, there's all sorts of licensing issues go into that, and I'm sure the big font houses are really not going to be too happy about the fact that these things effectively are distributed. But I don't want to talk about that. I'm not interested at all in fonts today, because typography, from a classical sense, is much more than just font use. And I think there's an awful lot of simple things that we can do on the web to improve typography. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Is that cool with anybody? Yeah, a bit of change of pace. So as I say, I've learned a huge amount from Mark Bolton in particular, who's been talking about this for a while, and it is his hobby horse. So there's lots of good resources out there. So this is kind of like a bit of an aggregation of all sorts of things that I've found and have then been adapting into a lot of the stuff that I do. So simple steps that we can do to improve typography on the web. Well, the first thing that really we need to discuss is this whole notion of browser styles. Now, quite often, if we did what I did earlier on, which is to go into Firefox and use the web developer toolbar to remove CSS, quite often we refer to that as unstyled content. But that's actually technically not correct, because something is still styling that content. What is that something? Exactly, it's the browser's default style sheet. Now, they're pretty much the same these days, but there are, one or two kind of annoying variations, in particular with the way that browsers handle forms, for example, particularly padding in form elements. So one of the first things that we should be doing anyway when we're writing CSS, but it's particularly important when we start to think about typography, is to actually try to get a level playing field, to effectively reset the browser so that all of the browser defaults are the same. And really the principle behind this is so that any style which is applied, whether it's margin or padding or width or whatever it happens to be, borders, are what we put in. They're the styles that we write, rather than relying at all on a browser's default. So there's been a number of different methods of doing this, a number of different ways in which we can accomplish this. And this was the one that came up, oh God, a good few years ago now. Andrew Crispanis, I think he works for SitePoint these days, but Aussie chap. And I'm sure that he wasn't the first person to think of it, but he was the first person that I remember writing about it and giving it a name, in terms of this notion of the global white space reset, which is effectively to use the universal selector, star selector sometimes it's called, and basically just zero out margin and padding across absolutely every element that appears on a page. So who uses that on a regular basis? Fair few. Okay. Now, this, I mean, for at least a year or so, this was like the default way that we would kind of do a white space reset, and it works fine. But it does play havoc sometimes with other form elements, with other elements, particularly inside forms. And also it doesn't handle every single issue. So the guys at Yahoo, as part of their developer library, what they call the YUI library, released as part of a whole kind of suite of CSS style sheets. They released their own reset. Now this was part of, there was one for font normalization. There's even like a grid kind of framework that they publish. And again, as part of this YUI library. So they were going in, and obviously this one's got a lot more detail. So it's doing things that are above and beyond just margins and padding. So some elements we're zeroing out the margin and padding, but then we're being a little bit more specific in terms of the fact that I'm going to reset here border spacing on tables, removing borders, default borders from images and field sets, taking away any list styles. So in essence, every single style that I see on a page should be a style that I write or a rule I want, rather than something which may come straight from the browser. And then, because he can't leave anything alone without putting his own stamp on it, Mr. Meyer had a huge kind of thing on his website a few months ago, back in May, I think it was, where he started to actually look at whether or not the Yahoo reset was enough, and there was it was a collaborative process in the end. Lots of people commented, and he ended up with this kind of reloaded reset, which is the one that I've been using most of all recently, and it seems to do a very, very good job. So essentially, absolutely, it's zeroing out, it's effectively removing any defaults whatsoever from the browser, so that everything that I add onto a page is what I want to add onto a page.
Sorry, do you create a separate distinct style sheet just for the reset?
Well, sometimes I would actually have this in a separate file. It's fairly short and it's cut and pastable, so often it just sits at the top of my regular style sheet. But it depends on how you're layering your CSS. I mean, often it depends on how complicated your CSS structure is as well. So, if I've got a fair amount of style sheets that are having an effect on a document, I might actually put this inside another style sheet, rather than having to have another HTTP request. It looks complicated, but actually the overall weight is quite small. So the first thing that we want to do when it comes to creating better typography is to remove any browser default. So any margin and padding and other elements that we add onto a page are going to be the ones that we want. Now, there was an article back, I think it was last December, on 24ways.org, which is Drew McClellan from the Web Standards Project. He does this thing every year, 24 Ways, where he gets articles written for free by people, and he just publishes one a day. There's some really cool stuff goes on in that, and last year, probably the best one, apart from my silly example, but definitely the best one, was Rick Rutter's vertical rhythm article. And Rick's been delving into real typographic theory over the last few years, and this was a brilliant article because he really brought home the importance of understanding typographical principles, but also in the real world how we can make documents much, much more readable and probably at the same time a lot more accessible from a cognitive point of view, just by learning things from old school typographic methods and then applying them to the web. And it's something that we rarely do. So if you look at a lot of websites, you'll find that generally speaking, the vertical, we're often concerned with widths on things. But when we look at a lot of websites, particularly content-heavy sites, there's very little attention paid to what goes on in that vertical space, particularly when it comes to body copy. And this is something that Rick was keen to help people address. So this is a passage of standard browser text. So without any attention to typography, this is how the browser would just render 2 blocks of text. So we've got our main content and then our sidebar. Now, I don't know where it was said or where I read it, but I seem to have it stuck in my head that it takes us about 25% longer to read stuff on screen than it does to read stuff on paper. I'm not sure how true that is. But I know for a fact that, particularly as I'm getting older, I find it a lot harder to read stuff on screen than I used to. My eyes get tired.
It's because the screen dots are made up of dots and your brain has to put them together, where on paper they're actually formed fully.
Yeah.
And you don't notice it, but your brain notices it. You have to make the dots join up.
Yeah. I get really tired sometimes, and often at night I might want to kind of put my feet up on the desk and read blog posts, and it actually gets really quite tiring. And also, in terms of helping people assimilate that information, the more and more information that you put onto a page, I think the less and less people actually read it. So to me, that's already too much information to take in any one sitting. And there's not a huge amount there. How many times have you got a client that's given you, pages and pages of Word documents? I had one that was 3,000 words the other day. I said, it's not a bloody dissertation. Give me the summary. But there are some simple things that we can do, perhaps, to make this a little bit more easy for people to consume. So just by changing the font to something which is more readable on screen, I've just changed that from a serif font to a sans serif font. These new Microsoft fonts, by the way, the ones that ship with Vista, like Calibri and Corbel and those kind of things, they're great. They're really good. But the other thing that we've done is to pay attention to the actual line spacing itself. So we would term this, obviously we'd term this leading in old-fashioned typographic terms. But with CSS, we generally refer to line height. Why they just couldn't have bloody called it leading in CSS, I have no idea. But there's some interesting things going on here. Let's take that. Hopefully the lights are going to let us actually see this. Is that visible, really? Yeah? If we apply this baseline grid, so what I've done is I've set an 18 pixel baseline grid as my default, and I've calculated that by a couple of different methods I'll come on to. But we can see immediately that we have this 18 pixel vertical lines that cross the page. But look how the text sits. Just by applying basic line height, we've improved the readability. But what we haven't done is got any rhythm going on, particularly when we look at the font size across on the right-hand side, because the font on the left is smaller than the font on the right. So there's something which is, I'm going to talk about this on Thursday in terms of rhythm in comic book design, but rhythm in any design, particularly in web design, is extremely important. And having something which, musically in our minds allows us to easily move down a page, rhythm is extremely important. And you can see here how that, even though we've made the text readable, we've not really adhering to that vertical rhythm at all. Things are starting to cross lines and be all over the place. So if you look at that in detail, and you can see here how on the right-hand side, because that font is smaller, that text size is smaller over there, that we start to get all sorts of inconsistencies going on. So there are simple ways in which we can actually make even basic copy like this much, much more readable, just by applying some basic typographic controls. Now, the first thing I'm going to do in order to make this work is I'm going to set a base font size. Now, the base font size that I've chosen here, in terms of applying it onto the body, is 12 pixels. Now, I know we're going to get into that conversation about should we be setting fonts in pixels. And we might talk about that if we get a little bit of time later on in terms of accessibility issues. But what I'm doing here is just to apply that 12 pixel base level font. But with all of the paragraphs, I'm then essentially saying, right, okay, that 12 pixels equates to 1 EM. So then I do have, if I need to, increase in text size. But here, what I'm doing is I'm calculating that my line height is 1.5 times that browser default that I've set at the top. So my line height becomes 18 pixels. And I'm also setting 1.5 M's worth of bottom margin. Okay, you'll see some examples of this where it's actually set to 18 pixels, or multiples of 18 pixels. But here that 1.5 M's equates to that. And then the last paragraph that might happen to be inside any container, I'm just setting margin 0. So effectively, the way of calculating this natural rhythm to create an 18 pixel baseline is to multiply the font size that we've chosen by 1.5. And you can see immediately that that has an issue. Well, not immediately because I'm on the wrong slide. But what about that sidebar? What about the fact that the text size on the sidebar was smaller than the text size on the main content? Well, what I can do is I can say, okay, I want that to be smaller, but I'm going to calculate how much smaller it is. So I'm going to divide 10 pixels, which is what I want my font size to be on the right-hand side, by the baseline font size that I set at the beginning, which is going to give me 0.833, which is what the size that I set in ems. And I can then take that 10 pixel font size for the right-hand side, and to create the right line height, I divide that by the 18 pixels, which is what my baseline to be, which gives me a different line height to what I had on the left-hand side. And you can see the effect that that has. Immediately, that then makes that text stick perfectly to that vertical rhythm. And all over, that content's far more readable. You know, it's much more easy now for me to assimilate. So just a very, very simple technique. Not talking about fonts or anything particularly complicated. Just a really simple way of using a clever bit of maths to really open up the design. If you look at that with some bars going on, you can see that irrespective of the fact that the sidebar has a different font size to the main content, that vertical rhythm's still being maintained. Okay, so far? Now there are one or two problems with this. If you look at it, to me, the gap between the content, the lines of content on the right-hand side, are a little bit too open. You know, your mind has to kind of join the dots, interpolate almost between the different lines. It's a little bit more effort for me to actually scan down and read that content on the right-hand side. So sticking to that vertical rhythm is really important, but in some cases, you know, particularly when we start to get smaller font sizes, it starts to create a little bit of a problem. So this is where Mark Bolton, again, has come up with this concept of what he calls incremental leading. Did anybody download his presentation from Matt Media this year? No, okay, he really explained this far better than I will. So if you go onto markbolton.co.uk and download this. But his concept was that I need to keep adhering to the vertical rhythm, but I want to avoid an excess of white space, particularly when I start to make font sizes smaller. So if we go back to here, do you want to get that? If we have a look at this, and then go back to our example, you can see where we were before in terms of the right-hand side matching perfectly that rhythm on the left-hand side. And it's creating a little bit too much in terms of white space. Now we need to keep that vertical rhythm in mind, but how do we calculate the right type of leading adjustment to be able to make that a little bit more legible? So let's talk about the ways in which we can actually measure this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look and I'm going to say, right, okay, I want to judge roughly how many lines are going to become my benchmark, if you like. How many lines of copy over on the left-hand side I want to use as my adjustment. And I'm going to pick 4, because 4 is a reasonable number, and it makes the maths easy too. So if we work out that 4 lines of text in that left-hand column at 1 EM, okay, if we take 18 pixels, which is our line height, and multiply that by 4, you just get 72 pixels. So the effective height at browser default of 4 lines of text is 72 pixels. That's fine. Keep that in mind. But now what we want to do is we want to decide on how many lines of text on the right-hand side equate to 4 lines of text over on the left-hand side. So we're going to say, okay, well, for every 4 lines on the left, we're going to have 5 lines on the right. It's going to get away on every single line from that baseline grid, but it's going to meet up at different points to, again, just bring back that vertical rhythm. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, we know what our font size is, and now what do we calculate in terms of our line height for this? So we're going to take our 14.4, divide that by 10, and then we're going to say, okay, 5 lines of text on the right equating to what's on the left. We're going to say, okay, we're going to divide that 72 pixels height by the 5 lines, and it's going to give us 14.4 pixels for each one. So then what we can do is we can take that 14.4 pixels, divide it by our base font size again, which was 10 pixels over on the right-hand side. And that's going to give us our new line height. So the line height on the right-hand side is going to be slightly different from the line height on the left-hand side. But that's going to give us something which we haven't seen before. Now, if you look back at this example here now, you can see that not every line adheres to that vertical rhythm. But what happens is, if we zoom in, is that down to every 5th line of content over on the right, we stick to that rhythm. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4 lines of copy on the side, on the right, on the left, and 5 lines of text on the right. So every 5th line is going to adhere to that vertical rhythm. So it's not every line that's going to stick to that baseline grid, but every, in this case, every 5th. And you might want to adjust that according to the specifics. Does that make sense? And it really does open up the page. So you can see here with this one, each one of those 5 lines sticks there really nicely. So maths was never my strong point, but I have found that this has made a real difference, particularly when you've got lots and lots of pages of heavy content. It doesn't match up. Well, that's probably because of it's a keynote slide and not a real screenshot. That's the basic principle. This is just keynotes. So one of the things that I really encourage people to do is to think about the way that content is presented. I mean, lots of people seem to be from like government departments and universities and stuff like that, where I'm convinced you'll be given huge amounts of information, huge amounts of content to put on one page. And, you know, focusing on just the small details, I think, makes an enormous difference, particularly when we start to then think about, you know, maybe taking these principles and applying them to, I don't know, print style sheets. Quite often we do print style sheets as a kind of like, oh shit, I forgot, we need a print style sheet. And then you end up spending half a day writing a print style sheet. You know, maybe we should be thinking more and more about actually making the print style sheet a work of art in its own right. So there's lots and lots of stuff that we can do to improve it. And when we actually look at this in more detail, this is a real graphic example. Over on the left-hand side, we've got our unstyled or little styled default content. And over on the right, we just open that up. Now, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I do when I'm designing quite a lot is I kind of like sit back in the chair and squint at things. And there is actually there's a very good reason. There's actually a real reason for doing that, particularly when it comes to typography. And that's a topic which is called Optical Gray. Have you come across this before? Just as a really quick example. I'll squint at it for you. When you squint at something, even if it's just two two very similar blocks of text. Notice that the block on the left appears darker than the block on the right. And really the general principle is, particularly when people give you enormous amounts of text, is to look at that, and if the optical grey is very, very dark, then you know that there's too much going on. You know that you need to work on the typography. The lighter the optical grey, the much more easily understandable that content's going to be. So, has anybody got anything to say about that? Is that all cool? No. And the cool thing about this is that it doesn't matter what browser you look at it in. Even IE. Now, a lot of these kind of calculation things, I don't know, there's been a buzz, hasn't there, for a while, particularly in relation to JavaScript, about frameworks and whether or not, you use Prototype or, I don't know, give me some more, I'm not a JavaScript guy. Yeah, all of that kind of stuff. And, people have been wondering about whether or not we need prototypes for frameworks for CSS. And there's been a few people that have been kind of working towards that end. And there was a guy, I've forgotten his name actually, but you can certainly Google it. And I think he's a Polish guy actually, and he published this CSS framework called Blueprint CSS, I don't know, a month or more ago. I mean, it wasn't that long ago. And it brings together all this kind of stuff. So browser resets, baseline grids, incremental leading, all of this kind of stuff that we were just talking about there as a fairly easily digestible framework. And he's taken it a little bit of a stage further, and he's talking about the fact that if we're working to an 18-pixel baseline grid, then let's make all of the images that we use, the height of those images, multiples of 18 pixels. Well, who thought of that? I didn't. What a great idea. He's done some things with it which I'm not so happy about. There's a lot of emphasis, a lot of easily digestible grid stuff in here. So if you actually dive into the markup and the CSS, he's got a very neat solution for being able to do things like spanning columns. But his markup isn't as optimized as it ought to be. So you've got things like column, class equals span 4. And lots more kind of presentational stuff going off into the markup, which really kind of, sticks at the back of my throat, particularly, in relation to what we were talking about earlier. But that's not to say that we ought to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's a lot of good stuff in this blueprint, particularly in relation to typography and vertical rhythm stuff. And again, it seems to be a collaborative process, and lots of people are kind of adding stuff to it. So check it out. I mean, I know that my old matey Jeff Croft from Blue Flavor, whose work this was partly built on, is a great big fan of this. So if you look at stuff that Blue Flavor have been putting out recently, it's all built on this. Some of it works for me, some of it doesn't. But it's well worth checking out. Have we used it yet? There's a few nods. What do you think? Yeah?
Yeah.
Do you go down the whole span class thing?
For prototyping, yeah. If I need something up and running quickly to show off, I can chuck it up there and then I can adjust it later on with my own classes.
Right. That's not a bad way of doing it, actually. I'm out of Red Bull. I might go to sleep in the next 10 minutes. I might have a huge sugar crash. So, that's kind of typography stuff. And I'm a real fan of looking at different media, whether it's comics or magazines or newspapers or whatever, and bringing back in some of those design principles and that attention to detail that you'll find in other forms of visual medium into what we do on the web. And this is why I really don't think that the conversations about CSS are finished at all. Because, there's loads of stuff that we can do, and people are refining and coming up with new ways of doing this stuff all the time.
It's an interesting step in the design process that no longer exists, or hasn't existed for probably 25 years, was the galley of type.
Yeah.
You'd send the copy off to a typesetter see the type out of context of a printed page or whatever like that. When you talked about greying out, we used to have to turn it upside down and see what the grey of the text looked like and whether the headings were prominent enough and things like that. Made those judgments on a galley, often by, as I say, turning it upside down or just looking at it in an abstract way.
So now, do you turn your monitor upside down, or do you stand on your head, or what's the best way of doing it? I mean, seriously, do you think about type on the web that way still?
I definitely still think about type weight, grey, and the relationships between the body copy weights and the headings and so on like that. Yeah.
Who designed for print? Oh, fair few. So how frustrating is web stuff then? Yeah. Fortunately, I've not had to pick up a copy of Quark Express for like a very long time. But no, I do think that there's. I mean, Jason Santamaria, him and his matey Rob Waitchett, they work at Happy Cog with Zelman, and they took themselves off last year and did a. Oh God, what do they call it? I've forgotten what they bloody called it now. Letterpress. They did a letterpress class. And they had 6 weeks, they only had one night a week, but they took them 6 weeks to lay out a verse of an Edgar Allan Poe poem. And they said they learned more about typography in those 6 weeks than they'd learned in 4 years in college. Because, they're only young and they'd come through college and it was all Quark Express and, other digital media. And I think you can, when you look at some of the stuff that Happy Cog do in List Apart and, their other work, you can really see some of that attention to typographic detail. So, enough of maybe what we can do now. Who fancies thinking about what we might be able to do next? Possibly. That's what I thought we'd do for the last session, is to have a bit of a chat about CSS 3. Now, I've got a very important announcement to make on Thursday. And I'm not saying anything about it up until then, apart from the fact that the word 11 is involved. Internet Explorer 11. Yeah, I'm going to be living on a beach with Kylie Minogue by that point. Does Kylie know? No, but I'm working on it. No, I'm going to talk about something to do with CSS 3 on Thursday at the end of my thing. So I hope you'll all be there. There's a lot of conversations going on about CSS 3, and I mean, there's been a lot of pretty bad-tempered debate about and comments about the W3C over recent months, hasn't there? I mean, if you read what Jeff Croft wrote and what certain other people who shall remain nameless I've been writing about the W3C. And, Zelman's been doing some stuff as well. I think there's a lot of frustration amongst designers and developers as just what the hell is going on with CSS 3. And I was one of those people that was standing, throwing stones at the working group as well, until they brought me on board. And I have to say that I've done very little, to be perfectly honest. I've certainly not done enough to justify being on it. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that I'm not a technical guy at all. I mean, I can't write a single line of JavaScript. I have no idea about PHP. I don't know anything about any back-end technologies whatsoever. I just pay people to do that stuff. And I don't have a degree in computer science because, I'm a painter. That's what I did. That's why I was not, this stuff. Well, maybe some of that stuff as well. I was an art student, so art stuff is what I do. And, that's where a lot of designers are. But, the people that tend to hang out around the CSS working group are not like me. They're made up of browser makers, Microsoft, Opera, Mozilla. You've got big players like AOL on there. You've got other special interest groups on there. And you've got a bunch of academics. In fact, if I've got some, I'll show you a few recent emails that I shouldn't show you. that have been going on around the CSS working group, because to be perfectly honest, I can't keep track of it. I have no, I mean, somebody sent me an email the other day and it was like this stuff that might as well have been written in Swahili. And at the bottom it just said, Andy, question mark. And I actually wrote back and just said, I have no idea what you just said. They think differently, and this is one of the big problems with CSS. First of all, the big problem is in communication. They don't know how to talk to people, for the most part. I'm going to phrase this more politely on Thursday. But as we're not being podcast, I'll say what I think. They don't know how to talk to people. They don't know how to communicate with designers. If you've ever tried to contribute to the CSS working group mailing list, and even if you have a really good idea, like Aaron Gustafson had a few months ago, you'll get a response back like, well, we talked about that in '97. You know, refer to this document. As if we haven't got anything better to do than trawl our way through the CSS archives. The other thing is that they're not designers. So they don't know how we want stuff to work. And this is a big problem. So, I mean, they don't know about classical design principles. I mean, Halcom knows a little bit because he's concerned with print sometimes, but they don't really understand stuff. And the other and most important factor is that most of the people on the W3C CSS working group, lovely people though they are, all of them, apart from Dave Barron, lovely people though they are, and hard-working. There is a lot of work going on there. They have a massive job. But the problem, I see it, is that most of them work for other companies, and they work for browser makers. And the stuff that I've seen pushed through the quickest has been the stuff that's been pushed through by the browser makers. So all the generated content for page media stuff was pushed through by Halcom, who has a passion for that, and lo and behold, it's only supported in Opera. Why should the browser makers decide on our tools? Why should they decide on what we can do with CSS? It should be us, shouldn't it? And it should be us to decide on what we want, tell the W3C what we want and how we want it done. They ratify it with a great big rubber stamp, and the browser makers can fuck off and make it, or not. And if they choose to implement it, then that's a commercial decision for them. I don't care that it took 8,000 lines of code to implement min height in IE7. I couldn't give a shit, because it's a multi-million-pound company that's making that happen. But I don't care about the economics. They'll either do it or they don't. It should be for the browser makers to do what we want and not to decide on the tools that we should use. That's the problem. And I'm going to say that slightly more politely on Thursday with Bert Boss in the room. He's a lovely guy, actually. But there is some cool stuff, CSS3 stuff coming up. Now, one of the things with CSS3, and I said earlier on that we shouldn't really grumble that much. If we grumble about CSS3 too much, we have to look to our own backyard a little bit, because if we're not using what's already there in CSS2, because we're so bloody petrified of not supporting things in IE6, then we can't really grumble that much. You know, if we can't use what's there, if we don't use what's there now, what are we going to do with this stuff? As and when. The thing about CSS3 is it's not one specification like the others have been. It's divided up into a bunch of different modules with the express intention, believe it or not, of making these things appear quicker. Hasn't quite happened that way. But also it's designed so that the browser makers can choose to implement bits or not. Now, you know, it would be commercial suicide for them not to implement it, but, you know, that's up to them. It's not up to us. And there's a bunch of different things in there broken down into modules. And we're going to go through some of it. Selectors module. So we've got new selectors. Actually, to be honest, a lot of them we've already seen already today. A lot of that stuff that we're talking about in terms of some of the attribute selectors are in the selectors module. And there's more too, which we'll have a look at. Backgrounds and borders. How often have you wanted to stick a different background or multiple backgrounds on one element? The hoops that we have to go through for multiple background images, it's insane. Multi-column for the lady on the side there. My particular favourite, the advanced layout module. Oh my God, this is the coolest thing. We're not going to see it this side of Christmas. I'm not sure which Christmas, but with everybody's help, we should be able to push it in the right direction. And
Can you just, sorry, that sounds interesting and you didn't really explain it.
I know, because I'm going to show it.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And then media queries. Now, media queries are the coolest thing, and already loads of them are supported by Opera, because lo and behold, they're How Comes Big Passion. So just being able to combine CSS rules with particular queries to say, without JavaScript, to say, if this type of device, then do this, or if the browser width is less than this but more than this, then do something else. Very, 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 very interesting stuff, particularly when it comes to different type of devices. Has anybody got a Nintendo Wii? Yeah, a few people. Have you tested sites on it yet, on the telly? First thing you did. You are such a geek. Did you not do bowling?
I did bowling.
You need to get out more. But of course it opens up a whole different world, doesn't it? You start looking at sites on a games console, particularly a really cool cheap one. And there's a wee me somewhere out there of me. Cindy Lee did. But there's lots of cool stuff going on. And really, 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 we need to get this moving as quickly as possible. So let's have a look at a few things. Some of this is with examples, some not. Selectors module. Wouldn't it be cool to have this stuff now? Now, some of it looks incredibly complicated, but let's start off. I'll just quickly run through these. Nth child. This is great, isn't it? How often have you wanted to style a table with alternate rows? And then another piece of, so you put class of odd or something on it. And then somebody squirts a piece of content in halfway down and the whole thing breaks. So this is great. Just being able to say the nth child of an element. So the second child, for example. We've got last child. So we saw first child earlier on. Last child. This one here, this is great. A combination of nth child and last child. So you can count back. So you can say, okay, I want to target the list item which is third from the bottom. This is so cool, because then you're going to be able to say, well, you can forget about adding extra classes into things. You can just be completely flexible. It doesn't matter what content's squirted in by the CMS. It's always going to be the list item which is third from bottom, which is going to have the fat border. Or you can say, right, the nth of type. So how about a paragraph? I want to style every 14th paragraph on a page. Doesn't matter where it appears in the DOM, as long as it's a paragraph, that's what I want to style. Or, this is a great one, the only type. This would be great, just to style the only something that appears. Or, here's a good one, the not selector. So it just doesn't match. I think I should have had a missing space there. So I could say, right, I want to target all of the list items that are not in something else. And then we've got, this is what we were asked earlier on, the preceding element. So this one's going to style an F, so a paragraph, let's say, that is immediately preceded by something else. So lots of cool selectors, but we're a little way off it yet. So let's have a look at a quick example of some of this stuff. Going back to our Scar band. Simple track list. That's the usual thing that we do.
How is an element preceded by another element different to an element being the first child of another element?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be the first child.
Sorry, oh, okay.
A heading's not, doesn't encapsulate a paragraph, so a paragraph after a heading is not a child of the heading.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So going on to this is what we do now, isn't it? Adding class of odd or class of even or whatever it happens to be, just to do, I think Aaron calls it zebra striping. It's such a pain. Wouldn't it be so much cooler?
Exactly.
Well, this is where JavaScript is incredibly important because, yeah, this is where JavaScript props, there's a whole bit in the book, And I'm a big fan of actually using JavaScript to do the stuff that we will be able to do with CSS3, but not yet. Talk about that in a minute. But wouldn't it be even cooler to just forget about JavaScript altogether and think about, okay, I want to do exactly the same effect, but this is going to style every odd row. So you see here, table row, nth child, 2n plus 1. So this is going to style every odd row, and 2n is every even row. It doesn't matter what content I square in. This is great, isn't it? The first 6 rows of a table. So you've got product listings. I don't know. Oh dear. One was I was trying to download a driver for my scanner the other day. So I went onto Epson and, the most you want to maybe target the first 6 rows because they are, I don't know, the most recent or current products, and all the rest of it is ancient old stuff. So just being able to style the first 6 rows, make them bigger and bolder, without having to put classes or any other kind of hooks for CSS into the markup. Or the last 2, minus n plus 2. That's going to be great. Those are the ones that kind of fade off the bottom of the page. And it just gets really complicated if you want it to be. It's kind of going to end up like, who mentioned regular expressions earlier on that I didn't understand? Is this like a regular expression? No. Is it like Perl? So, just why you would want to, I really don't know. But being able to target the 9th and 19th and 29th, etc. of a table. Well, if you get beyond 29 rows, then there's something seriously going wrong with your table. But, it's possible.
Does that stuff work in IE6?
This stuff?
Yeah.
This stuff doesn't work in any browser. Actually, no. He said, now I'm going to really show my geek credentials because some of the nth child stuff works in Conqueror for Linux. I don't know what Conqueror is, but I've heard things about it. What about stuff like that you have to do? Class of left and right and left and right, and then somebody squirts in another album and the whole thing just flies away and you really have no fun. So why don't we just do exactly the same thing but with floated images, nth of type on images. I'm only going to target images. It's the 2n plus 1, or the odd floats it left, even opposite floats it right. Much cooler, and what we're trying to do is just take this separation of content and presentation one stage even further. I mean, if we do the stuff we've been talking about throughout the day, then we're doing a good job. But this stuff's going to really help us separate content and presentation a lot more. And if you combine this with different media queries or different CSS types for different devices, it's incredibly interesting. So what about first of type? There's my list item. I want to highlight just that particular list item there from the discography. So usual stuff, class of first. Well, JavaScript, you're going to write that in. You can do that kind of stuff with JavaScript at the moment, and it's a perfectly legitimate way of working. But it would be much nicer if you could just do first of type. And it's just going to pick out that. So all list items are the first of type inside unordered lists. So selectors are really going to, we've seen some really cool stuff that we're not using as much as we ought to. All the attribute selectors and child and adjacent selectors that we were looking at earlier, we don't use those enough anyway. But it's just going to go selector crazy. And the selectors module is actually the most mature. There's really no reason why that shouldn't be a candidate recommendation pretty quickly. Because to be honest, most of the stuff's tried and tested anyway. The other good thing about it is that Tantek Chelik's been in charge of actually that module, so he gets stuff done. Next thing is backgrounds and borders. And there's all sorts of new funky stuff inside backgrounds and borders. Some of it you can actually use now, strangely enough. background clip and origin, background size, all of this kind of stuff. The background stuff itself is completely unsupported in anything at all. But the border stuff is. In Firefox, if you use the -moz- prefix to the style rule. So the idea, this comes on to some progressive browser makers actually trying to get this stuff working in the real world. And the Mozilla guys are actually really good at this, in that a lot of the stuff that is coming up in CSS3, they do support already, but they support it with this -moz extension. And a lot of people ask, well, why do we have to have this -moz extension? If they can support it with a proprietary extension, prefix, why can't they just support it anyway? And the answer to that is, well, it's not finished yet. And it would be suicide for the browser maker to support border radius when the spec for border radius isn't finished. Because they might have people that really do use border radius in anger, and then find a year down the line or 6 months down the line that the spec changes and the stuff's broken. So it is quite sensible for them to allow us to try things out by doing these proprietary prefixes. So check out border radius as if anybody is interested in that. And of course, the biggest thing for me, if I'd invented a time machine, I'd go back and get them to put multiple background images on one image. Because it's just, why didn't they think about it? If you go back to the drafts, believe it or not, of CSS1, and I've not spent like nights alone with the CSS1 spec, because, I have other things to do. But if you go back, there's all sorts of really cool things in there that never actually made it. Background gradients, for one. Wouldn't it be great if you could specify the fact that you wanted something to go from black to white and the depth of the grad without having to use any images? Well, that was all there in CSS1. But the problem was that the W3C is so bloody politically complicated that some bright spark said, oh no, that's SVG. That's SVG, that. So we can't have that in CSS. And it went. And of course, SVG's done naff all. And we've been left with no background gradients. Again, it's us suffering for the W3C's lack of mobility, let's say. So you want to do rounded corners on, multiple images. That's the kind of stuff that we do, whether or not you put that in your markup directly, all these extra elements to allow you to add different backgrounds, to give you that nice rounded corner thing. Whether or not you add that directly, or you do as a lot of people do, which is to write that stuff in with JavaScript. At the end of the day, you're still putting it into the document. Don't kid yourself that because you're writing this crap in with JavaScript that it doesn't really matter. You're still committing the crime of putting it in. But you have to for certain things. It's still there in the document, whether or not you write it with markup or JavaScript. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just, I want to put multiple images on that one paragraph. That's all I want to do. I don't want to have all of this additional cruft. And this is the CSS that I will be able to use. In Safari, we can do this now. Kudos to Apple. I'm just going to be able to add multiple background images in a certain order to the same element. And once I've defined the source of the background image, I can define individually whether or not I want it to repeat or not. Because some of them at the corners I don't want to repeat, but the stuff across the top I want to repeat X, and the stuff down the side I want to repeat Y, and to create my box. And the actual positioning of it as well. So lots of cool stuff, and you can experiment with this. How many people here use Macs? Yeah. So good stuff. The nice thing is it degrades fairly gracefully. So you can do stuff with multiple background images now for the 3.5 people that use Safari in the real world. But it shouldn't really cause much of a problem. But so many people start thinking about multiple background images because of this whole kind of Web 2.0-y, glossy, roundy, cornery thing. But you know, there's loads of things that we should be able to do with multiple background images that just don't involve having to create the next Web 2.0 darling. I mean, what about adding multiple background images to things like body and HTML, or containing elements that go around everything, and using transparent PNGs so that when the browser's resized or people scroll or things move around, that you get this wonderful kind of layering. I mean, what happens if you want to start adding more than one image to just the body and start building up a design with lots and lots of transparent images? Well, it would be fantastic to be able to do that without having to, twist our markup until it bleeds. And, that's actually fairly. Backgrounds and borders, some parts of it are, some parts of it work fine, and some parts of it are hopelessly broken. And there's a lot of work that these guys need to do because they just don't understand what it is that we need as designers. They have no concept. This is a section about layering multiple background images from the W3C spec. So I'm going to go and have a cup of tea until somebody can translate that into a language that resembles human. Yeah, I know. Now, it's just geek language. It's beyond geek language. Now, the fact of the matter is that the W3C does not write documents for us. They are not an educational body. Sorry? You've got academics and computer scientists on there. Well, quite possibly. You've certainly got zookeepers and butchers of the English language. But the problem is that they're not supposed to write stuff for us. They're supposed to write stuff that they're specifications. And we all know what happens with them. They're like technical blueprints for buildings so that somebody can get blamed when the building falls down around your head. They're specifications for browser makers and other people that write software that are far too clever for their own good. They're not designed for us who actually have to understand the stuff, which is fine when they're built, possibly, but when we have to have an input, or should have an input, in what the next generation of tools are, then Christ on a bike, that ought to be a little bit easier to understand.
Doesn't it mean that the number of images can go from 1 to the maximum number of images?
You've been reading that too much.
Number of sizes, the bottom one says that the maximum number of layers is equal to whichever of those elements has the most number of objects in it. That's right.
You're a smart pants.
You're too. You smart ass. That's quite possibly what it does mean. But in general, you get my point. Why doesn't it say what you just said? Because, I half understood that. And I wasn't really listening, truth be told. The key point, and this is something I'm going to touch on in my secret thing on Thursday, is that things need to be done in a slightly different way if we're going to get the tools that we deserve. And we shouldn't have this tendency, which we have had up until now, of throwing stones at the CSS working group and complaining that things take so long when we do knob all to help. Let's face it. And these specifications and these tools are not there to be handed down to us like Moses and the Ten Commandments. Shouldn't it be our decision what goes in and what goes out and how things work? And we shouldn't just sit back and wait for these things to arrive. We should actually actively participate. And that's all I'm going to say about the secret.
Well, you better tell us because we might not all be there.
It's a hook.
We'll be there now.
It's a hook. Right, multi-columns. Where's my multi-column lady?
Me. No, that was
It was somebody else. Don't you try and step into her shoes. She's my woman. You're still playing, put that thing away, you're playing solitaire. Multi-columns. Multi-columns are fun. Because going back to what we were talking about earlier on, columns are presentational, but we like them. And they are useful because they help break up our stuff into nice logical chunks. And if you do come to my thing on Thursday, when we start talking about comic books, then it'll make a lot more sense. So, column module introduces some new stuff. Column count, pretty obvious stuff. Column width, column gap, column rule, which is a dividing line between columns. Now, again, you can put stuff like this and test it out now in Firefox with this moz dash moz dash column prefix. And you can actually start playing with this thing now. I don't know what the market share for Firefox is, and it's still pretty small, but it's a damn sight more than it was. So we can really start to actually, in the real world, start to use this, find out when it's good, find out when it's crap, find out where it breaks, and hopefully report back so that when it is a final recommendation, at least stuff works properly. So going back to our blog post again, which is where my column lady asked her question. That's a regular blog post type page. And if we look back at that markup again, it's exactly the same as it was before. So a div containing all of our lovely, luscious, meaningful content. So let's have a look at some markup. Because I'm such a microformats geek, we've kept all of the H-entry type stuff there for the H-atom micro format. And, okay, you could say it's a little bit div heavy, but the divs are there, or the classes are there, for a particular reason, which justifies it as far as I'm concerned. But this is the key stuff that's interesting. That's our markup with the microformats applied. Let's have a look here. Entry content. Let's just remind ourselves where that was. Entry content. Where are we? Yeah, it's not on there. Oh, there we go. Div class of entry content. And then inside that we have various paragraphs. That's where our blog quote lives. For some reason it's not on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we're going to say, right, entry content, which is a div. I want to create 3 columns. Now, notice that I don't have a width assigned yet, but I always want it to be 3 columns with a gap of 5 pixels between them. And I want a rule of thin and solid black, just a line. Now, if I want that to work in Firefox as well, which is where it's only going to work at the moment, I can do more or less the same thing, but with this -moz prefix. Notice that I've not bothered putting in the column rule thing there, because they haven't actually put that in for a reason only known to Osama bin Laden. So that's what we get. We apply that CSS, and that's what we get. That div area, headings, paragraphs, lists and all, that's where our columns are created. They're not there as a visual. They're there as a visual thing, but they're not there in the markup because columns are presentational. Now, we can fake this kind of stuff as well with Firefox. With JavaScript. And there are some different techniques that we're able to do with that. Now, notice that there is a missing ingredient here. In that, actually, am I going to cover this? Although we can add a column rule in between each of these columns, they've given us the wonderful choice of solid, dotted, ridged, which is something I use a lot, groove, and all of those border properties that we never use. The one thing that they've not put in are images. Why can't I have an image as my dividing line? So I can set repeats, and I can have an animated flower that opens and closes, and little ants that march up and down, and you can just imagine with border image from the backgrounds and borders thing. Imagine animated GIF borders. That's going to be so cool. Can't wait to try that out.
You're going to specify the width in your columns though, so all you need need to do is put multiple images in as your backgrounds. You can make it yourself.
Well, the interesting thing about the columns, I'm going to demo this in a minute, but the interesting thing about the columns is that if I say that I want 3 columns, obviously it's going to adjust as the browser expands and contracts, it's going to adjust the width of those columns. Automatically, or the other way of doing it is to say, I just want every column to be 10M or 20M or whatever it happens to be. And then it's going to automatically create the number of columns for me, depending on the space. Might have a look at that in a sec.
Have different size columns?
Sorry?
Can you have different size columns at the moment?
No. And you can't style a column. Which, I know. How crap is that? You can't say, I want every second column to have a nice grey grab background. Hence my secret thing on Thursday. Appetites are whetted. But we can do the same thing. I mean, this is the comments area. So all I've done is I've said, right, okay, I want the unordered list, in fact it might be an ordered list, of comments on this particular blog post. And all I've done is I've said, right, column count 3, and it's divided up that list. So, by the magic that is television, what's the time, by the way?
4:45.
Ooh, we might just actually squeeze it all in. We might well do. Right, so. Ooh, cursor. Come back. Right. Do you know, I've not actually opened that file. The contents of my hard drive are exposed to the world. Sorry? No, that's right, there's no porn on there. Oh God, I've got a story to tell about that in a minute. Where are we? Blog article. There we go. So, that's how the thing looks in the browser. Now, I can't remember how I specified this. I can change it in a minute. See that depending on the width, those columns will change. But you can't set min width on a column. Yeah? So, you know, you might end up with something which is completely ludicrous. The other thing, actually there's some more stuff that has gone in recently under the radar. But you know, you open up every damn newspaper in the entire planet, and it has this grid design convention where the heading always spans the number of columns of the article. And usually speaking, on the front of the Sydney Morning, what is it? Herald, there'll be a nice big picture, and it will usually span 3 columns that go underneath it. And there's this convention. I mean, whether or not you're reading, you know, Asian newspapers or Middle Eastern newspapers or Western newspapers, and I've seen some great stuff from, like, you know, Siberian newspapers. And my entire site is a homage to Siberian newspapers. But you look at that, what it is. I'll show you, read the book, you'll see. What was I saying? Oh, yes. Stuff that we have in newspaper design that you would think, I mean, do members of the working group read newspapers? I think so. But those kind of things are just missing completely. So what happens if I want a heading to span multiple columns? And then when I have another heading, it breaks those columns and then restarts them again. Wouldn't that be cool? I'm afraid we'd be sadly disappointed. So it is cool stuff, but it's a really good example to me of a bit of a half-assed kind of solution. And I think that now is the time, really, that we can help the working group to, you know, provide the type of tools that we deserve. So enough of the bandwagon. I will show you one more thing. Now, I haven't actually got an example of this because I actually ran out of time putting the slides together. But for those people that have bought the book, and even those that haven't bought the book, if you go to transcendingcss.com/support, or actually even from the homepage now, you can find the files. There's actually a working demo of the advanced layout module that you can download. Because a guy from the University of Oviedo actually got his team to write a JavaScript emulator. He's one of the guys that's on the CSS working group, Cesar, and he actually did some really cool stuff by making this JavaScript emulator of advanced layout. So you can download it. It's just a series of scripts and some examples. You can download it from the book site because I sadly didn't have time to make a new example. But this is potentially the coolest thing in terms of finally breaking that link between visual presentation and the structure and the order of content. So let's take that. You could say to yourself, okay, well that's, could be relatively easy to do with floats or positioning or some of the techniques that we've been talking about today. So you might have a list that you float the elements, and then a div which contains some paragraphs that you do the multi-column thing with, and then another list. But this isn't part of this list, it's something else, and actually this list up here, actually he is part of that list. So there are ways in which you could possibly twist it, but it will be such a difficult thing. And then you inject new content with a CMS and the order of something changes, or the client turns around and says, no, I've got to have the albums at the top. Because actually semantically they don't make sense at the top. Perhaps they make more sense at the bottom. There is this link always still between the visual presentation and the order of the markup. And finally, we hope, this advanced layout module, which is, they call it like this, the working group's kind of playground or pet project, a bit like the Apple TV is for Apple. They don't kind of put that much weight to it, but to me it's the most fascinating thing. Because what it's going to do, it's going to introduce some really cool stuff. Now, what you've got to imagine, going back to this, is you've got to imagine that, similar to tables in a way, that the advanced layout module creates an invisible, stretchy grid across an element or across an entire page, no matter what you apply it to. And each slot in that flexy, stretchy div, stretchy, it's been a long day. Stretchy grid has a name or a number or a letter applied to it. And we don't need to actually apply that grid specifically to any element. We apply it as a canvas, in a way. We say, this area here, I want to have so many seats and in so many order, but I'm not actually concerned at this moment in time who sits where. That's probably the best analogy. But I just want to create the format. I want to lay the groundwork out, and then use some different type of CSS to actually make this work. So the first thing that we need to think about once we've understood this stretchy grid is that we can give each one of the slots in the stretchy grid either or a letter. Now sometimes it may be a number, it may be a name. They haven't quite decided on what's going to happen yet. But that means that I can then say, oh, him. Don't look at me like that. Him, element, list item, I want to apply him and position him in slot A or slot C, irrespective of where he is in the order of the document in terms of the source. Bit like positioning, but better. Alternatively, I may have an @ symbol. This is weird stuff. I don't know where they get their thinking from, but it's very cool in theory. And this is a default slot. Now remember that normal flow thing? Normal flow of a document where stuff starts off at the top left and kind of works around until it gets down to bottom right, the normal flow. We take positioning and we actually move an element, we position it somewhere else. But particularly if we absolutely position it, the stuff that's in the normal flow has no concept that it's there. It's completely outside the normal flow. So what this is designed to do is to say, okay, some of the stuff I'm able to position, but other slots I'm going to leave empty. And then anything which is in the normal flow is able to flow up into them. I'll show you an example. And then you've got a white space, a period, where this thing's reserved. This slot, nothing's going to go into it. I want to use white space. and I don't want anything else to flow in. So let's have a look at this. First thing we're going to do is, and again, I'll say you can actually download this emulator from the website. First thing I'm going to do is I'll say, right, this is the grid that I want to define. I'm going to apply it to the body, and I'm going to apply the display property. And I'm going to say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. That's defining my slots. That's saying I want 3 rows, and each row has 4 columns. And I could do that in any combination that I wanted to. I'm just naming or numbering the slots. And that's how it would look, in essence. Now, then what I can do is I can take an element, him, where's he gone? Him, list item, or in this case, a div with an ID of SO2, and I'm going to position him in slot 3. Doesn't matter about anything else. Doesn't matter about his position in the normal flow. He's going to go into slot C. This guy is going to go into spots G and H, spread across 2 different slots. So effectively, again, I say it's breaking this link between the visual look and layout and the actual order of the source. Perfect. So we do something like that, and we're able to reposition elements visually without changing the document order at all. So we will be able to really position things exactly where we want to. Now, the emulator that you can download actually uses absolute positioning to kind of parse this CSS. So you can use this real CSS, this position stuff, and the slot stuff, and then the JavaScript just turns it into absolute positioning. But it really does help to kind of visualize it. So the idea is, again, that it breaks this link between meaningful content and the visual display, which has kind of been the theme for the day, really. And this is like the end of it. So, but what about these guys? Because the slot letter stuff, that's interesting enough. But what about these guys? This default slot where content in the normal flow can flow, and stuff that's reserved, slots that are reserved with a white space period. So, I'm going to position some things. I'm going to position him by giving him a slot number or letter, and that, and that, and that. I'm going to say, right, these slots are reserved. They've got periods in them. And that might have been a div or whatever it happens to be that we've applied this to. But what about all this other content in the normal flow that's not yet been assigned a place? Well, it's going to flow. And it's going to go start off down here, and then it's going to go to here, and then it's coming to here, and then it's going to bypass that bit and flow onto there. And on and on and on. And if the text increases or the font size increases, then it's just going to keep flowing. How cool is that? But there are lots of problems. I mean, you can probably think of like 1 billion of them right now. You know, what happens if there's so much text that this slot that we've just added, like the last bit, you know, it's okay when there's a little bit, but what happens when there's loads of it? Where does it go next? Does it just disappear? Or what happens? And these are the questions that the W3C working group, they can't answer because they don't know how you want it to behave. So that's why it's really important to actually download these type of emulators and make blog posts about how you want something to work. And even if you just do Photoshop comps and say, this is, I've had a look at this and it makes no sense whatsoever. And this is how I think that it should work. Provide some good examples, tag it with CSS3 or whatever so that Technorati can actually read it. Send emails to me and I forward them to the working group and often hear nothing. But, get involved, do it, because it's really important, I think, at this moment in time, at point in history, that, designers take back CSS. And, let's not leave it to a bunch of billion-dollar corporations or academics to decide on what we're going to do next. So that's cool stuff. Amazingly, I am bam on time, which is quite cool. So a reminder of a shameless plug. Any Q&A that you want, but I'm done. Thank you very, very much for listening to me. So, what time is it, Gary? 5 dead on. Jesus, I'm the master. No, we can spend it, as long as we don't get kicked out, we can spend as long as you like. Is there anybody that wants to say anything? Gentleman at the back with a Superman t-shirt on. You're coming to my comics thing on Thursday, are you? Sorry? Well, as long as you wear that t-shirt, I can take the piss out of you mercilessly for the whole session.
Andy, I just wanted to ask you what your take is on frameworks that are coming out, like Blueprint and Triple CSS frameworks. Are they good, bad? Should we be using them?
I think whether it's JavaScript frameworks, of which I know nothing, and CSS frameworks, I think the thing is that if you understand CSS really well, and like this gentleman down the front here, you just use them for certain things, like this speed up his prototyping time. As long as you understand what they're doing, this goes for JavaScript as well. As long as you understand what they're doing, that's fine. But if you use them as a substitute for learning, then that's not fine. Because when something breaks or you don't understand what's happening within a particular environment, if you don't understand the core reasons for that, then you're going to be stumped. So they're okay in context. But I wouldn't ever recommend, certainly for students, steer away from any of that kind of stuff. You know, it's almost worse than Dreamweaver. Who else had a question?
Could you explain the URL slide?
Oh, sorry, yes. They're up there. I did actually put them up earlier on, so they are there, but please don't hit them all at once. Anybody got anything else?
One facetious question. Why is your difficult client always a northerner?
Why? Well, because I'm a northerner. And it's the only accent I can do, really. I mean, I can try Welsh ones.
But no, every planet has a law.
You're a Doctor Who fan. That's a Doctor Who quote.
It's so easy. It's one of my very favourites.
But no. Hello. That'll be the Doctor. No, it's the only accent I can do. And my grandmother comes from the north, and she says really nice things. Anybody?
Yeah, when you were talking about advanced layout stuff, is there any idea about what the tab order would be for that?
I don't know. Have you any idea what the tab order would be?
No, I was just wondering if the CSS group has discussed that yet, or that's sort of a future conversation, or...
Do you know what I think the thing is that if you've got an opinion on what the tab order should be, then please say so.
Does anyone have an opinion about what the tab order should be?
You know,
Changing around the
I can't say for definite whether that's been discussed or not discussed or even thought about. But this is where, if you were to write a blog post or an article on a list apart or Vitamin or whatever that said, I've been looking at this thing and I've been really, this is how I think the tab order should work for these reasons, blah, 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 blah. I bet 9 times out of 10 you'd make a difference. Anybody else? There's a... God, is that all the CSS questions done?
There was a question about fonts when you were resetting fonts back to 12 pixels, which had actually went down to setting the fonts back to 70%, and it was 62.7.
Yeah.
Why didn't you use that?
Because I used what the Blueprint one was.
Oh, right, okay.
Because that was a convenient segue into the Blueprint one.
Okay.
Richard and Mark are actually it's Mark. Mark's way of working is always with pixels. So I do suggest that you actually look at Mark and Richard's original stuff because it's far more lucid than mine. So, are you off?
Yep.
Have fun.
That's what...
That's a really good question, you bastard. Yeah, the navigation is marked up as a table. Okay, I'll show you. Take care, mate. Right, let me try and find it. Okay. This design is shamelessly stolen from, well, not shameless, not all of it, bits of it. When I was writing the book, I was doing a whole load of newspaper kind of research stuff, and I found this paper called, it's the Chelyabinsk Worker. And they had this, in fact, it's here somewhere.
Did you have that at the Web Directions last year?
Yes, I did, yeah. Yeah, I did. It was before it was in this absolute bargain of a book. Anyway, it's in here. And I was really fascinated by the way, two things. The way that the image wrapped around, the text wrapped around the image both sides. And I wanted to steal that. And the way that they'd got the navigation, if you like, on the front of the paper. So that they had like the title of the article and a little summary and then the page number that you were going to find it on. And I just really liked that. And I thought, well, I'm going to steal that because I don't see that. I haven't seen anything really like that on the web, to be honest. And that was the design. And then when it came to actually marking it up, I went through all sorts of things. I mean, most of the time we use list for navigation. And I thought, well, is it a list? And therefore, what's inside every list item? And I tried putting headings, paragraphs, and then numbers inside there, and floating and positioning and doing all sorts of stuff. And I tried definition lists and all sorts of different ways. And in the end, I was too bloody lazy, so I used a table and then justified it to myself and to anybody else that asks in that it's tabular data. Well, it is, and nobody's going to disagree with me, because that's a table head, and that's a T thing, and then there's another one. And I won't lose any sleep over that.
Is that a nice numbers a shortcut key, like with the alt, if you go alt through, so go for it?
No, because I don't use access keys at all. No. Derek Featherstone convinced me that they were bad and that I shouldn't use them. So, no, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's not the best solution. Because one of the things that I realised soon afterwards was that in testing, and you know, my wife and other people kind of like using the site and going, this is crap, was that I originally just got the title as the link through to the next page, and then people said, well, why isn't the whole line clickable? And she was trying to click on the numbers. So in the end, what I did was I made everything bloody clickable, to be honest, so that the title's clickable. That's a separate hyperlink to the description, and to be honest, it is a bit messy. So if anybody wants to think of a better way of doing it and do work for me for free, that would be really nice. So I don't know. It was, to be honest, there was a story about this in that I'd started working on this design, around about Christmas time. So I'd spent about 5 or 6 months working on it. And my chap, Owen, that works with me, he was over in the studio. Because everybody that works with me works remotely. There's only me in my little place. Anyway, he was actually over for a rare royal visit. And we got it all finished. And we were originally going to host the site at malarkey.co.uk on Media Temple. But we set it all up so that it runs Expression Engine, which is fab, and it's a MySQL database. So, of course, I put the database under the malarkey.co domain on Media Temple, and then we decided to host it on stuffandnonsense.co.uk. So I ported that domain over, thought to myself, well, I don't need malarkey.co.uk anymore, so I hit delete on the server, so I didn't use one of my Plesk licenses up. Without realising, of course, that it was going to delete everything to do with that domain, including the MySQL database. And I lost all the content. This is on a Wednesday. I lost all the written content, all the CSS, and all the JavaScript. Absolutely everything. Templates, CSS, the work, HTML, everything just went. And I had a backup, this is like lesson kids, I had a backup of the MySQL database when I moved to Media Temple, 3 months old. I had the JavaScript that PPK had written for me in an email. And I had the external images. Oh, and I had 3 screenshots of the site in a presentation, and that's it. I lost a lot.
The server would have backup.
No, I phoned Media Temple. I phoned Media Temple, and I said, I was on the mobile phone in the garden, smoking like 15 fags all at once. And I said to like the MD at Media Temple, you know, is there a way of getting this backed up? And he said, did you back it up? I went, nope. He said, dedicated server. And that was that. It was gone. So I came back in and literally destroyed my cell phone. And that was on a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And I then didn't sleep until about 4 o'clock on the Friday afternoon when it went live. And I literally rebuilt the whole thing from scratch in 3 days. Everything. Not graphics, everything. And to be honest, it was a better job the second time around as well. I mean, there are some kind of crap bits like that navigation, so thank you so much for pointing that out. But overall, it's a better job.
You now use source code management systems for all your code after that?
Nah. See, the good thing is that I hardly ever build websites anymore. This is the best thing for me, is that I set out the store with this website and I said, we design stuff. We design stuff and we do templates, we do CSS, we do markup, we do user experience, kind of blah, 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 blah. We don't build complete websites for people. So to be perfectly honest, I don't have to worry about that stuff much anymore. I mean, I think as a company, I think we host about 3 websites. And I'm just not interested in building websites for people. You know, I'm waiting for content to be delivered 4 months late with images embedded in a Word document. Who wants that? So that's fine. No, I don't, because I don't have to anymore. But I do back up everything religiously from this point on. Take care. Is there anybody else, or are we done? We done? Thanks very much, guys.